What the? Another video? Alright, let's do this. What do I feel is the best deck slash budget deck? Well, I'm a bit biased, but I'd have to say that it would have to be anti-meta. Now, that's not just one deck, mind you. Anti-meta is a very broad, encompassing thing. I can mean anything from hardcore lockdown to stun type decks to anything in between those two factors. Now, for those of you who don't understand the difference between anti-meta and stun type decks, well, anti-meta is a deck that is designed to look at the top of decks and designed to shut them down in one way, shape, or form. And the reason that this works is because usually there's one common overarching theme in most of the top tier decks. Lately, in like the past 6 or 7 years of Yu-Gi-Oh! In fact, since Synchro Plants were really popular, I'd probably say the biggest thing would be special summoning. So, anti-meta decks, generally speaking, try to stop special summoning. And lately, and even back then, graveyard-reliant decks. So, things like zombies, synchrons, plants, let's see here, Shaddolls even a bit, Burning Abyss, especially get screwed over if they don't have access to their graveyard. They all just sort of die. And I think Necros even don't like not having a graveyard, because I believe that all their searches require stuff to be sent to the grave to work, and if they don't have a grave, they can't search, which means the deck is hurt a lot. So, why do I think anti-meta is the cheapest deck? Well, honestly, most of the anti-meta cards have been reprinted a ton of times to the point where they're basically dirt cheap. I mean, Ryo is relatively cheap given how strong of a card it is, and that's probably one of the strongest anti-meta cards, and it needs to be at 3, damn it! It would give us another option to just run over Denko. But, in other news, anti-meta is sort of one of these big ambiguous things. It's sort of as I don't want to say standard, but it's sort of like as encompassing as just calling a deck a beatdown deck. Many decks can be beat down, and in a way, some anti-meta decks are beat down. But it's one of the cheapest decks because most of the cards have been reprinted a lot, and it's very generic. And that's a huge plus, because most of the cards in it, you can use in other types of decks too. You can run Bottomless in any other types of decks. You can run Fiendish Chains in other decks. And what this means is there's a constant demand for them, but there's also a constant supply of them because of Konami will always reprint these, unless they're really retarded, and will usually be reprinting stuff. So we constantly have these really cheap, really strong cards that we can just throw into our anti-meta decks. For instance, I personally have been trying to use Fiendish Chains over Breakthrough Skill, which is something that I've been wanting to try, but lately I got lucky on some common Fiendish Chains. I think they're common. They might be super, I forget. They're on their way, but I've been playtesting with them online, and I've been having a lot of fun with Falcon anti-meta. And recently I changed from Atos anti-meta to Falcon anti-meta. And that brings me to my another point. Anti-meta has a million different forms. There's Falcon anti-meta, there's Atos anti-meta, there's Rock Stun, there's even Dragon anti-meta. I've seen Medolchi anti-meta, I've seen, hell, Hero anti-meta to a degree. And let's see here, what else have I seen? How could I forget? Evil Swarm, that's it. Evil Swarm, Ophion, anti-meta card. And it's really cheap to build compared to other decks. Necros, Burning Abyss. Why are you still so expensive? Huh? But The best part is that not only are these decks relatively speaking cheap, I think a good, let's see here. It would probably cost you about $200 to $250, depending on how lucky or unlucky you are, to get a full anti-meta deck with extra deck, which, by the way, is usually pretty generic because you don't really use your extra deck too much, so you don't even need an extra deck if you really are hurting on money, and you'll still have a fairly decent shot at winning. And all those XYZs, synchros, or whatever you're running are usually very generic, so you can just throw them into other decks if you ever decide to stop playing anti-meta. In which case I hate you because you're not playing the meta, most likely, and I will just build a deck to beat you. But another thing that's great about anti-meta is that the cards that are in them are not likely to be nerfed. I mean, what are they going to hit in anti-meta? They already hit Riot, which I strongly disagree with. Can they hit Fiendish Chain? No, that's retarded. Are they going to hit Skill Drain? Okay, that could possibly happen, and if it does happen, Konami needs to get their brains checked. Could they hit Seal of Orichalcos? We only run one anyway. Why would you hit a card that you can literally only use once? What can they legitimately hit and not screw over every other type of deck and not look like complete and utter idiots? Next to nothing. And even if they did hit those cards, that just means that we just throw in some more traps, be it Dark Bribes or Wiretaps. And if you say that they're going to hit frickin' Dark Bribe, no, I am not running Wiretap. Screw that card. Dark Bribe is better in almost every other situation. I'll probably do a video on that too. But yeah, so basically, anti-meta decks are very cheap, relatively speaking, generic so that the cards can be used in other decks if you ever decide to disassemble it, and they're not likely to get hit. And the best part is, they're practically easy to play. Like, they're not rocket science. Yes, you need to plan ahead. Yes, you need to be able to read your opponent. Okay, those are important things you need to do in order to play anti-meta well. Knowing when to bottomless, when to flip over your big lockdown cards, how and when to play your Banisher or your Dyna, whatever, what to bounce with Falcon. Okay, fine. Those are all kinda tricky, and I'm putting tricky in heavy quotation marks, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't really that hard to understand. But it's a really easy deck, and you can have so much fun with it. And you have so much fun because the opponent literally doesn't get to play the game. You have, quite honestly, just turned this switch, and their deck suddenly can't play well. They legitimately have nothing to get around you if you've built it right and played it right. So then why isn't anti-meta played or placed in YCS? Well, I don't keep up with YCS, honestly. But honestly, anti-meta decks are fairly slow. And that's probably their biggest weakness. The day that we get very quick anti-meta decks is the day that anti-meta becomes meta. And honestly, I hope that never happens. That'd be retarded. Yeah, that should never happen. As much as I'd love to play it. But what else can I talk about here? Oh yeah, I mentioned stun decks. Now, what is the difference between a hardcore anti-meta deck and a stun deck? Now, a stun deck is usually an anti-meta deck, but whereas, generally speaking, a usual anti-meta deck focuses on just shutting down an opponent's play, a stun deck is more of a, I guess you could call it a tempo-based deck. You set the opponent behind a turn, and you just use that one turn advantage or two turn advantage that you built up by just locking them out for one turn and then just wreck their face. Okay, key example. An anti-meta deck might, and I personally think this is retarded, run Royal Decree. Why you would do that, I don't know, but I'm just using this as an example. If said anti-meta deck ran Royal Decree, you could probably call Royal Decree more of an anti-meta card, whereas Trap Stun is a stun card. The difference is that Trap Stun only works for one turn, and you use that one turn where they miss their opportunity to mirror force your whole board to just wreck their position and they can't recover from it. Or if they do try to recover, you have built up so much of a hand advantage or a field advantage is that you just don't care. You just repeatedly smash down anything that they have, and you just keep playing off of that advantage. You are effectively ahead of them in tempo. Whereas anti-meta, you just basically say you're not playing the game. You're playing it beatdown style back in 2000. Let's go. My 2,500 point Mist Valley Falcon versus your Graph. I'm pretty sure I win. Oh, by the way, your Graph is banished because I also have Banisher of Radiance with 2,100 attack points. And you can't even touch it because I have Orichalcos on the board. I love anti-meta. Recently, I was playing some guy and he didn't understand what the difference between non-meta and anti-meta was, and I explained it, and basically it turned into me saying anti-meta is built to counter the meta, and non-meta is just playing stuff that isn't in the meta right now. And he basically just said, "So you're an asshole?" And I said, "Yeah. If you're going to be literally playing decks that are next to automatic, like old Dragon Rulers, I'm not going to play that game. And you're not playing that game either. We're playing it my way on my terms. And if you can't adjust your deck to that, well, I'm sorry, you deserve to lose." So, in short, anti-meta is a fun deck for you. Horrible for the opponent, but it's fun for you. It's a cheap deck in more ways than one. And it's unlikely to be hit by Konami, thank God. Now all they need to do is hit Denko and we'll have a lot more fun. And quite honestly, it's a great deck to learn with because it's a simple deck. You learn a lot of interesting card interactions like Monster Reborn versus Ryo or whatever. What was it? Monster Reborn versus Call of the Haunted was something I learned while playing anti-meta. I Call of the Haunted his thing. Chain Call of the Haunted to his Monster Reborn, and he said, "Oh, I couldn't do that," so I was curious to see what would happen. So I called in a mod, and he said, "Hey, Monster Reborn fizzes." I just went, "Oh, that's really cool." And this is basically anti-meta. And anti-meta is a ridiculously flexible deck, too. So you can really just sort of change it with like 2 or 3 cards to completely change the feel of the deck. For instance, in my Falcon anti-meta, I was trying Armageddon Knight. And quite honestly, kind of worked, kind of didn't. It was sometimes a flop, it sometimes just wrecked an opponent. And then I traded them up for Breakers for more back row destruction. Frickin' Quill-Offs. Back when... I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that anymore. Quill-Offs are neutered, but I still find them annoying. And basically I just ran Breaker because I wanted more MSTs, but I needed more monsters. And you get to use some pretty cool cards. Like, you can run Aeatos, you can run Grand Mole, which is basically the king of fuck you, you're not playing this game. And, again, it's not likely to be hit. Because if Konami hits it, they're retarded, and no one else is really using it to make it into the spotlight. So, if anti-meta ever tops YCS, I will be genuinely surprised, and actually kind of sad, because that means that Konami might hit some of the cards in it. But the Yu-Gi-Oh! Wiki has 1,001 cards that you can use in anti-meta, just to give you an idea. And they actually have some admittedly out-of-date builds, but you can sort of see where they were going and try to update them yourselves. And that's really the best part about anti-meta decks. You can really make it your own. If you like to play Madolches, you can try to make a Madolche anti-meta deck. I don't know how well it'll work. Actually, that wouldn't be too terrible, except you rely on the graveyard. But I guess, would Chateau work with that? Oh, that's something to look into. You could try Elemental Hero anti-meta, which was actually a thing. You ran ALS and just went beatdown style on their face, and literally just said, "You're not playing the game." Although, admittedly, that deck probably sucks now with that Super Poly. But you could probably figure out something to make it work, or at least make it into a stun deck, I'd imagine. Darklaw is basically a walking anti-meta card lockdown bullshit. Also makes Madolche's QQ 9 out of 10 times, but whatever. You could try, what was that one? Evil Swarms. Ophion. Great 25-50 beater, so it runs over things like Dante and all sorts of other boss monsters. barely, but it still does. And you get your own forbidden lance that's searchable from it. You prevent them from summoning any level 5 or higher monsters. So until XYZ spam becomes a bigger thing, Ophion's not going anywhere. And did I mention 3 forbidden lances without any drawbacks? I'm just gonna throw that out there. Why am I not running Evil Swarms? Oh yeah, I don't like them. But yeah, you can really have a lot of fun just throwing cards and say, hey, what if I run this engine, like this plant, like a plant engine or whatever, or a hero engine or whatever, and just throw in anti-meta stuff and see how well it works. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But 9 out of 10 times, you'll probably find something that'll work pretty decently. You might have to get rid of some cards that might interfere, like, I can't think of an example off the top of my head. But you could probably figure out some way to make an anti-meta deck work for almost any archetype that isn't meta or special summon based, or heavily special summon based. Like, I would never run anti-meta Gustos, because they need freeze and the graveyard, and those are the 2 things that you desperately need. So, yeah. Again, anti-meta is fun, cheap, reliable, not likely to get hit, and you can customize it. That's the 5 reasons why I think anti-meta is the best budget deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm the Gamer Ninja. If you agree or disagree, post it in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time. Have a great night, everybody.